students, welcome to MOOC on Human Rights in India. In this module, we take up the second part dealing with the National Commission for Women. In particular, we will see whether there is any critique of the National Commission for Women's functioning and how can it be made a more effective body. Before we go further, let us briefly recall what has gone on behind the creation of the National Commission for Women. In fact, as you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in the year 1948. It proclaimed that all persons are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and men and women are supposed to enjoy all rights equally. This is echoed in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted in the year 1966, and again in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which was again adopted in the year 1966. In other words, these three documents, these three instruments which I referred, constitute the International Bill of Rights. They all proclaim that men and women have equal rights. In 1979, the UN General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and this convention is called CEDAW, was ratified by a very high proportion of world's countries. In fact, 189 countries have signed and ratified it and assumed all the legal obligations flowing from it. India also is a state party to the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And if you see, in 1970s, there was a feminist movement, and in 1975, the UN General Assembly decided to declare it as a International Year of the Woman. And in the same year, there was a world conference was organized in Mexico on the issue of women's rights, and at the end of which there was a program of action was adopted, and in that program of action there was a clear message. There was an encouragement to all states to create national and autonomous bodies for looking after the women's issues, looking after women's rights. And in addition, the United Nations has also declared the decade starting from 1976 to 1985 as the UN Decade for Women. And if you look at the Indian scenario, India was of course influenced by all these international developments. It participated in all these developments at the UN as a member of the UN General Assembly, and its own Committee on the Status of Women in India submitted a path-breaking, groundbreaking report with a series of recommendations urging Government of India to constitute a national level, statutory, autonomous body known as National Commission for Women to promote the social and economic development of women and also redress the grievances of women arising out of the violation of their rights. In other words, the National Commission for Women did not come out of any vacuum. There was a series of developments right from 1948 onwards, and there was a movement, feminist movement, and which resulted ultimately in the establishment of a National Commission for Women in the year 1992 under the legislation that was adopted in the year 1990. Now, let us turn our attention to the critique of the Commission. How did it acquit itself? It has completed now more than 25 years. So, in the 25 years, has it gone far enough? What has been its achievements? What have been its failures? And let's look at the critiques that have emerged right from its inception. For a body to be effective, it needs to have a number of things. It needs to have full financial resources at its disposal. Now let us look at the kind of budgets which have been, or grants which have been given to this body. They always hovered around 18 crore to little over 20 crores. See, India, we have about 130 crore population, and women hold half the sky, and for 50% of the population you allocate a meager sum of 20 crores, and if you really take it as a per capita terms, it works as a minuscule. So you cannot really have a national body, give it a number of functions and expect it to discharge all those functions without giving it an adequate budget. And in addition to financial resources, human resources are again very important. Right from the beginning, the Commission has been asking for more and more staff in order to perform its assigned functions, its statutory responsibilities. Now let us turn our attention to another important aspect, namely the role of the Ministry of Women and Child Development. Though NCW is expected to be an autonomous body, yet it is administratively tied to the Ministry of Women and Child Development. For all its requirements, be it staff, be it funds, be it sanction of administrative posts, it has to run to the Ministry of Women and Child Development. We have to see this in the backdrop of autonomous culture. In fact, institutions can flourish where there is a genuine respect for autonomy among everyone, but it's not so in practice. A body like this needs full functional, operational and financial autonomy in order to discharge the mandate given to it by the parliamentarians, by the lawmakers. Each of these aspects, functional, operational and financial autonomy, is critical to such bodies. Let's turn our attention to yet another important aspect, namely the composition of the Commission and the manner of appointment of chairperson and members. Women's groups have always held out that this entire process is a non-transparent one. The qualifications have not been prescribed, the vacancies have not been advertised, but the government nominates the chairperson and members of the National Commission for Women. The names of the persons proposed to be appointed are in public domain. It can generate a debate, it can generate scrutiny, but if it is not done in a transparent manner, and if political considerations come into play and people without substantial experience at the grassroots level in the women's rights issues get appointed, one can only imagine what will be their contribution. So in other words, it's extremely critical to appoint right persons for discharging this onerous responsibility, and that's why there is a need for proper selection, need for proper scrutiny, and need to ensure that only the genuine persons with proven track record of experience in women's issues at various levels only get appointed to hold these very responsible positions. In fact, on this body, the expectations of the 50% of women, their women's rights rest. So it's extremely critical to see that the appointment process is done in a transparent way. While on this appointment process of chairperson and members, it's very important to note a few more aspects. There are no worthwhile consultations with women's organizations or the civil society. What happens when there is no such consultation? The trust deficit increases between the National Commission for Women on the one hand and the civil society on the other. In fact, in practice, they both need to work in tandem to advance women's rights. But if there is a gap between the NCW and the women's organization, the gender equality movement becomes fragmented and it only affects the enjoyment of women's rights. This non-inclusive process also can affect the autonomy of the commission, in the sense that if a political appointee will not have the full freedom to pass an adverse order, and so that's why independence and autonomy are critical to the success, the functioning of the National Commission for Women. There is no coordination between National Commission for Women on the one hand and the state commissions. State commissions are appointed under a separate legislation. Ideally, there should be exchange of communication, information, and also strategies and a joint working between these two bodies, working at the national level and at the state level. That's in the best interests of the women's rights in the country. So that's why it is very important to have proper coordination between NCW and the state commissions, and the NCW should be able to take a leadership role in this process. Among the commissions also, there is one comes across what can be regarded as a hierarchical nature of the commissions in their status. For instance, there is a National Commission for Scheduled Castes or a National Commission for Scheduled Tribe. They are constitutional commissions and their origin is mentioned in the Constitution, and the chairpersons of these commissions are equated in status to that of a Union Cabinet Minister. You look at National Human Rights Commission, its chairperson and members are equated in status with that of the judges of the Supreme Court of India. So, and in this milieu, for the officials, for the government servants, one can easily see the hierarchical nature of these commissions. And when the chairperson and members of the National Commission for Women do not have a high status, it will obviously impact on the implementation of their recommendations. Let's say there is a violation of women's rights, and if the National Commission for Women summons an official over to Delhi to ascertain facts, and what if that official doesn't turn up And so what is the recourse open to NCW? To compel the attendance of senior functionaries in the either in the center or in the states. Currently, there is not much they can do to compel the attendance. Though they have powers of a civil code, they obviously need more powers to compel attendance. Similarly, it can make recommendations, but it has limited powers for enforcement of these recommendations. If you look at the National Commission for Women's Act, the Government of India is expected to seek advice from the National Commission for Women. But what if the Government of India doesn't accept the NCW's recommendations? What can NCW do to enforce its recommendations? There's hardly anything that NCW can do. Many years back, NCW brought out a black paper. We normally are aware of the white papers, but this black paper contained hundreds of recommendations which had not been acted upon by the authorities. So, in a way, they require additional powers in order to be effective. And the NCW looked at its own statute, made or suggested important amendments, but these amendments are yet to see the light of the day. So, as a result, and in practice, NCW comes across as a research body, as a recommendatory body, though a number of functions have been given to it under the Section 10 of the NCW Act, yet in practice, it's a recommendatory or a research body. Having said that, the situation is not entirely bleak. Over the more than past 25 years, NCW has done a great deal. For instance, Mohini Giri, as the chairperson, as a past chairperson, brought great visibility to women's issues without much powers, and they have also initiated many research studies, held Parivarik Mahila Lok Adalats. But if one needs to see the critics and also the achievements, one can say it is a mixed record, or the glass is half full. One needs to only see the gap between educational rights of women and men, the enjoyment of right to health by men and women, work participation by men and women. There is still a huge gap, and if you look at the situation of SC women, ST women who suffer from double discrimination, or that of a disabled woman or minority woman, it becomes more complex. So here is a body which has the potential and which needs to be strengthened further in order to realize, in order to promote the social, economic development of women and to protect women's rights. Thank you. See you in the next module.